I was at the State University Library last night, and I found a book that probably would have been absolutely devoured by John Wesley if it were around in his time. It's the first volume in a series of about 5 or 6 volumes called The Presence of God: A History of Western Christian Mysticism by uh, by Bernard McGinn. And I got the first volume called The Foundations of Mysticism: Origins to the Origins to the 5th Century. And I don't agree with every single conclusion he makes in this book, um, but nevertheless, it's encyclopedic and it's chronological, and it really gives you a good context to work with if you're trying to do a serious historical study on Christian mysticism. I've been aware of this for 20 years, and it's always been on my bucket list. So I finally sort of dabbled into it last night. And in a way, I'm glad I'm approaching it 20 years later rather than 20 years ago because I can see I can see more stuff now than I did 20 years ago in terms of orthodoxy versus heresy. And so um, my interpretation of the facts is going to be different than his. And I know I have a better idea of what early church theologians were considered orthodox and which ones weren't. Like, if I see the name Origen, Clement of Alexandria, or Gregory of Nyssa, I'm going to immediately be like, okay, those guys were universalists, those guys were Gnostics, those guys were heretics. I don't take those guys seriously at all. But if I see the name Tertullian or Irenaeus or Justin Martyr, I'm going to be like, okay, those guys were okay. Those were more or less church fathers in the Orthodox theology sense. And so those guys are fine. Um, we might not, you know, easily fit them into a Southern Baptist sermon today, but they pretty much agree with what fundamentalism uh, says, and uh, and so we we agree in that sense more or less with their writings, Justin Martyr, Irenaeus, Tertullian, um, with a couple of exceptions. But so what do I know now about early Christian mysticism in the Orthodox sense, in the sense that it agrees with Christian orthodoxy? Well, it seems to me that you have to know what you're looking for first to be able to find evidence of it in the early years after the time of the New Testament was completed. So one of the really big concepts in mysticism is seeing a vision, okay? Seeing a vision. So another huge concept is contemplation, getting still and focusing your mind on God and His Spirit in order for His Spirit to manifest to you. So, but seeing a vision is the clearest aspect of a Christian mystic's lifestyle, and so if you're looking for evidence of that, you're probably going to find traces of it in the early church fathers, and that's where you're going to find a starting point. Of course, there's other things too, like being in solitude and getting quiet and other things like that. But um, Matthew 5:8 was a really big deal to Justin Martyr and Irenaeus. So if you look at Justin Martyr's dialogue with Trypho 3-6 and Irenaeus's Against Heresies 4.20.7, there's this reference to Matthew 5:8. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. And that was interpreted by these Orthodox theologians. I mean, this is around 150 AD, 180 AD or so. That was interpreted literally. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. That was interpreted literally and was applied to the present life, not to when you die and go to heaven and see God. But it was applied to a present life in a literal sense. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. Um, those who live, in other words, those who live pure and holy, those who live pure and holy in the present life will see Jesus in their dreams and visions, like in Revelation 1. So in this sense, if we're looking for an example of New Testament uh, mysticism, probably the best example is Revelation chapter 1. What happens to the Apostle John in Revelation chapter 1? He's in solitary confinement in a prison cell in the Spirit on the Lord's Day. In other words, in a state of prayer and contemplation, Spirit-filled worship. His mind is focused on Jesus, and then Jesus appears to him in that silence and in that concentrated state in his prison cell. And he says, write to the 7 churches. So whether that happened into a dream state or as an open vision, I can't tell. I think it was a dream state because he said in the Spirit. Um, so it could have been that he fell into a dream and then turned behind him in the dream and saw Jesus. I think that was it. So I think that attaining a prophetic dream or attaining a vision of God is the goal. You get there through purity and you get there through prayer. Purity and prayer. Purity, prayer, presence. Purity, prayer, presence. Purity, prayer, see the vision of Jesus. That seems to be the goal, and it's Revelation 1, exactly like that. And then we see other predecessors of it in John the Baptist in the desert and Jesus in the desert, where there's quietness, there's separation from the world, the distractions of the business world, the distractions of worldly cares and concerns is gone. There is no sports, there is no news, there is no politics. It's gone. All of that stuff's gone. You're out in the desert where it's nice and quiet. You're seeking God in a prolonged state of prayer and purity, and you see God. Whether or not it's going to be visual or not doesn't matter. The goal is to either feel the presence of God or to see the vision of Christ. And then the angels come and attend to you occasionally. So that's what it is. It seems that the apostolic fathers, which were the early church theologians of the late 1st century, and different writings of the early 1st and 2nd century is essentially where you can see kind of hints and clues of these charismatic or mystical aspects. You can see it in the Didache, Clement of Rome, Ignatius of Antioch, Shepherd of Hermas, Odes of Solomon, Justin Martyr, Irenaeus, Eusebius' Ecclesiastical History, Hippolytus, Novatian, Tertullian, Cyprian, and Jerome, who wrote the Latin Vulgate, and then John Cassian. And if you want to drill in deeper into that early period of the 1st and 2nd century, just look at Charismatic Gifts in the Early Church by Ronald Kidd, 2,000 Years of Charismatic Christianity by Eddie Hyatt, Miracles and Manifestations of the Holy Spirit in the History of the Church by Jeff Doles, and Charismatic Experiences in History by Cecil Robeck. And then, of course, this book I just found called The Foundations of Mysticism by Bernard McGinn. It seems that in that 1st century and that 2nd century, the Sunday church service is where charismatic experiences continued. From the time of Apostle Paul up until the time of the first hermit, who was called Paul of Thebes. That's a person who lives like a monk, like in solitude in the desert. And it seems that most of it was kind of like an assembly of God or a vineyard church sort of manifestation of charismatic activity. Orthodox theology played a role in paving the way. When I don't mean Eastern Orthodox theology. That's not what I mean. I mean a Irenaeus, basically, against heresies, which is an anti-Gnostic form of Christian theology that was firm and crystallized. See, I think that's one of the reasons why a highly developed form of monasticism didn't happen until that was done. There was a 200-year period there where theology was still being hammered out, and so people needed to be really, really clear on doctrine before monasticism could begin, because you better be sure that you got your doctrine right if you're getting into isolation in the wilderness to seek after God. But this orthodox type of monasticism, where you got monks and nuns out in the desert, kind of began hearkening back to a lifestyle of prayer, silent prayer, exemplified by John the Baptist in the desert and the time that Jesus spent in the desert. That seems to be what was the impetus, the reference point. So Paul of Thebes was the first hermit who started what was called the Desert Fathers movement. And that was the beginning of a true blue anti-Gnosticism, Orthodox Christian monasticism. And he died in 341 AD. And then shortly following after him was Anthony the Great. He died in 356 AD. He was the second major figure, but because his was the first hagiography, Athanasius wrote his biography out. That's what really popularized the concept and grew into a whole lot of other imitators. There was a 200-year gap, though, between Justin Martyr and Paul of Thebes, and it seems to be it was because Montanism caused a lot of distraction, and Gnosticism caused a lot of distraction in that period. And so most energy in Christianity at that time was focusing on hammering out true doctrine versus false doctrine. It was more so focused on what's sound doctrine and what's Gnosticism, and let's make sure that we're not getting deceived by Gnostic apocrypha books and false doctrines. So there was a lot of demonic distraction around that, people having false dreams and visions about Gnostic ideas and stuff like that. Add to that, there was a lot of Roman Empire persecutions, and so it was hard for people to. There was a state of being destabilized for a while, a lot of destabilization in the churches, but they still had plenty of vineyard-like and Assembly of God-like examples of miraculous gifts popping up in the churches. So, but it was not. You didn't have this highly developed form of people seeking the charismatic gifts in solitude like you did in the 4th century. And that's because there was so much time that had to be spent over canonizing the New Testament, out of sorting out the Apocrypha writings, out of making sure that you're not going to be a Gnostic by accident, and then the Montanists on top of it. So I think there was a lot of, it was more of a time of intellectual culture, of intellectualizing the Christian faith, than it was of a time of living a prayer life. But the prayer life concept really started with the Desert Fathers in the 4th century AD, the mid 300s AD, in northern Egypt. And that seems to be where it started. And the concept of I'm going to seek God for several hours a day in a prayer life. I'm going to live a life of prayer. That is what led to an explosive amount of miraculous gifts of the Holy Spirit breaking through into people's life, in the lives of people that held to orthodox sound doctrine.